All right, let's reconvene for our third session, the Common Good and Contemporary Post-Liberal Policy. Sorry that our first speaker on the program, Professor Adrian Pabst, is unable to be with us, but this is more than offset by the fact that we get more time with our second speaker, who I'm very happy to introduce to you today. I'd like to welcome Professor James Chappel from Duke University in the US, who will be discussing post-liberal Catholicism in the United States. Professor Chappel, his book, Catholic Modern, was published by Harvard in 2018, explored how and why the Catholic Church in 20th century Europe came to accept liberal democracy and capitalism and to embrace the post-war democratic order. And he's currently interested in the post-liberal moment in US Catholic thinking. So this follows on very beautifully, in fact, from our discussion just prior to morning tea. So I'm delighted to welcome James Chappel. Over to you, James. I hope you have been able to hear me all right. Okay, good. Yes. All right, over to you. Thank you.
Hi, can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, well, hi. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really honored. I was sort of Googling some of you who are here, who have spoken before me, and was feeling like, wow, I'm not sure how much I have to contribute, especially now that I have a full hour to do it. So I guess it is my hope that I will give and it is a shame that Professor Pops couldn't be here because, as I'm sure you know, he is really at the center of these debates. And so I think what I would like to do is give some thoughts about post-liberalism in the United States, and from someone who is not, I do not identify, I'm not Catholic, I do not identify as a post-liberal. So this is a view, a kind of from the outside, and I hope that it can lead to some good discussion, which does not necessarily need to be with me. I know that you all have like your own kind of concerns, and it's totally fine with me if you all kind of chat amongst yourselves. I also was not able to make it to the earlier sessions. I was just it's nighttime over here. I was just getting my kids to bed and things like that. So so let me give some thoughts about post-liberalism and the common good in the American context. One thing, I mean, so it's very interesting that you all are doing these reflection around a theme of the common good, which has kind of crept, it feels to me, in America, kind of crept back into political parlance in the last 10 or 20 years. I did a very unscientific test to see if I was right about this. I know you may be familiar with Ngram, which is like a Google tool to let you know how common certain phrases are, based on everything they've digitized. And I thought, well, what about common good? And as I kind of suspected, it's been going up since about the 80s. There's a blip. There's a lot of it in kind of the 40s and 50s, which is a real moment of sort of Catholic anti-communism and a kind of Christian alliance. So that made sense to me. And then again, since about the 80s, you've seen it more frequently, and you see it now in the mouths of some quite prominent people. I mean, the current Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, and the current Vice President, J.D. Vance, used this language of the common good. They may or may not refer to themselves as post-liberal, and I know that is the more direct theme of this particular panel, so I'll talk some about that. I will say that and I think that this might that's why I'm such a shame that Adrian couldn't be here, as I was curious on about his take. I do not think that post-liberal is not a phrase that a lot of people use in America. It is used, I mean, academics will use it. There will be roundtables like this, but it is not something that kind of political actors will use, partially because I think the word liberal has such a different meaning in America as it does in other places. It's just kind of a confusing word in American politics. But there are clearly what we might call post-liberal tendencies, and even though people like Vance or Rubio would probably not call themselves post-liberal, they definitely are kind of sharing a stage with other people who do use that language. I think someone like Patrick Deneen, I think, uses this language, and so it is becoming more common, at least in intellectual spaces. So I thought that I would, in my time here, talk a little bit, and so I will be focusing here on Catholicism, on sort of Catholic post-liberalism. It is my real sense that the language of post-liberalism and the language of the common good has not been picked up very much by Protestants in America. I could be wrong about this. This is not a um, world that I study, but it is my sense that the sort of conservative Protestantism, Christian nationalist tendencies that we have here have not used this language of common good or post-liberal, which have tended to be a little bit more Catholic coded, I think. So I'm going to focus on Catholic post-liberalism. And I'm going to first say a few things about what was Catholic liberalism. Was there such a thing as Catholic liberalism? Um, then I'll talk for a few minutes about Catholic post-liberalism as an intellectual movement. And then I'll talk for a few minutes about Catholic post-liberalism as a political movement. And then I will, especially because uh, um, when they told me that Adrian wasn't here, they were like, "Oh, you should try to draw it out a little bit." So I will kind of use that gift to just give some of my like actual thoughts, like as someone who, as a historian in America, I'm an Episcopalian, I'm a progressive, and so sort of like where do I see, and I'm someone who also cares a lot about things that I imagine animate groups like this one, things like climate change, immigrant justice, things like that. And so I thought I would end by giving just some thoughts about where I see post-liberalism fitting in the American political context and what future I think it might have. So to go back a little bit, I think to understand Catholic post-liberalism, we need to understand something about Catholic liberalism. Is there such a thing as Catholic liberalism? It sounds a little bit like a contradiction. And if we think in the kind of liberalism as a specific sort of philosophical tradition focused on individual rights and liberties and religious freedom and things like that, yes, in that sense, there has not been much that you might say is Catholic liberalism. But if you think of liberalism in a broader sense as kind of participation in a pluralist society, participation in democratic politics, finding alliances with atheists or Jews or Muslims around common causes, running for office, things like that. In that case, there clearly is a kind of Catholic liberal tradition in this country. There is a long history of Catholics participating in democratic politics. Um, there, we have never had anything like a Catholic party here. Um, this is something that distinguishes us from the like European continent. We never had anything like a Christian Democratic Party. Um, we have had Catholics and Protestants on both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party for at least since 1900 or so. So it is true there was a fair amount of anti-Catholic prejudice in America in the early 20th century. There was a Catholic presidential candidate in 1928 who was defeated, and then of course we had President John F. Kennedy in the 1960s, and then President Joe Biden more recently. And so Catholics have had kind of high office in this country. We have many Catholics who are running for office, on both Democrats and Republicans. We also have a number of thinkers and theologians who have tried to give a sort of defense of Catholic participation in American governance. In the early 20th century, Americanism is decried as a heresy by the papacy, and so they had their work cut out for them. So then you have people like John Ryan, John Courtney Murray, people like this who are trying to say, look, we can participate in the American democratic experiment. We also had in the later, the Cold War plays a big part in this, where Catholics come to see that for all whatever flaws it might have, America, is fighting the good fight against communism. Communism had been decried as a heresy. It is seen as materialist and atheist and things like that. So a lot of Catholics say, well, the Americans are better than that. And so they participate in the American global politics. You start to see in the 70s and 80s thinkers and economists like Michael Novak who start to bring Catholicism into start to find this is in the era of John Paul II. And as I'm sure you all know better than I, like John Paul II has a sort of hard to place his economic theories or his political theories on a traditional spectrum, but at least some people, like his biographer George Weigel and like the political theorist Michael Novak, brought him in sort of a more free market or what you might call neoliberal direction. And so my point there is just that over the course of the 20th century, we have many Catholics who are participating in some kind of a liberal politics. And Joe Biden might be like, Biden, Kennedy are really represent that. I think that it has always been true that a lot of Catholics reject this on both the right and the left. On the left, you have figures like Dorothy Day, or there are all kinds of sort of more radical Catholic thinkers who reject this Catholic liberal tradition and try to find something more specific and more radical in the Catholic faith. You also had on the right people like Patrick Buchanan. So Pat Buchanan is a Catholic, often known as a kind of a paleo-conservative figure who does a lot. He runs some doomed presidential campaigns in the 90s that many see as kind of test driving the sort of campaign that Donald Trump would eventually run. I mean, it was very nativist, anti-immigrant, culture war kind of stuff. And so you do have anti-liberal Catholics around in the 20th century, but I think that it's not until more recently that you see some kind of Catholic post-liberalism becoming pretty prominent. Like, I remember when Barack Obama chose Pat Deneen's book as one of his like summer reads of 2020 or whatever it was. Like, it has entered the conversation in a really surprising way. I would say probably in the past like 10 or 15 years or so. And I think that the financial crisis of 2008, the rise of the Tea Party, of course, and then of course the elections of Donald Trump really are scrambling American politics. So I think since 2008, American politics has been in a ton of ideological turmoil, and I think that Catholic post-liberalism has been one of the sort of creatures that have emerged in this really complicated period in American ideological history. So let me talk a little bit about what it is. I think that most people here probably have some sense, and I'm not sure how much I can even add to it. I think that what Adrian would say if he were here, because I've listened to him talk about this before, is that Catholic post-liberalism is something that is not trying, or at least claims not to be trying, to revive some kind of medieval thing. I mean, it rejects liberalism, but sees itself not as a return to before liberalism, but as something that could come after liberalism, that could learn to see the mistakes in liberalism, see all the ways in which liberalism has led to degradation of the climate, economic inequality, the empowerment of technology companies, like all the crises we see around us. The Catholic post-liberal will say, yes, that is because of liberalism. Liberalism has been tried and it has failed. And it is now time to kind of regroup around a new political ideology that will be forward-looking, that will reject those parts of liberalism that led us into this crisis, especially its individualism and its concern for individual rights as opposed to ideals of what we might call the common good. This does take a number of different ideological forms. I think one thing that makes post-liberalism hard to talk about is that people have different ideas about what it means. It's like postmodernism in that way. I mean, it has so many different valences. I think that for somebody like Patrick Deneen, as I understand him, and someone like Rod Dreher, I mean, I think there are a number of people who are these Catholic or Orthodox critics of liberalism who really see a return to some kind of localism. This has been such a part of the Catholic social tradition for forever, like the idea of empowering local communities, subsidiarity, things like that. And so I think that one variant of Catholic post-liberalism is a lot about that. It's about empowering local communities, which would mean kind of disempowering the administrative state. So I think that Catholic post-liberals will often see the administrative state as their enemy. One approach to that is to kind of dismantle it, as we've seen, in fact, happening recently. Another is to want to take it over and utilize it. And so there are others who are kind of more aggressive sorts of post-liberals. And I think that Adrian Vermeule at Harvard Law School is the most prominent of these, who say, well, in modern times, the administrative state is very powerful. We can't simply wave it away, but what we can do is take it over. And so what Vermeule wants to do is basically disempower the courts and place ideological allies in a lot of key positions inside the administrative state in order to turn the state into an instrument of the common good as he understands it. And so the idea that what unites all of these people is a sense that modern politics is adrift, the liberal project has failed, the government is no longer providing what it ought to, which is some kind of sense of the common good. And I think that what makes it distinct, and I think that almost everybody would agree with that, right? The left and the right would agree with that, at least in America, where there's a lot of anti-systemic energies right now. I think what the Catholic post-liberal wants to say is the path to changing that does not go through sort of evangelizing, changing hearts and minds, bottom up, inspirational change to the growth of churches and charities and things like that. They want to see something more aggressive and something more revolutionary and something more political. Although they might differ over the form exactly that takes. Okay, so is there anything else I wanted to say about this? I mean, the two other things I'd say that might be kind of distinctive to the American case. One would be that there are very complicated relationships with Protestant Christian tendencies, especially those around Christian nationalism. So we have a senator named Josh Hawley, who is a senator from Missouri, who is Protestant. He also identifies as post-liberal. He has a lot in common with Catholic post-liberals, but he's a Protestant. We also have a lot of people who are more like Christian nationalists who would not use this language of the common good, don't like Catholics. I mean, there's still a lot of Catholic Protestant tension in this country. And so I would just name as the peculiarity of the American case that post-liberalism kind of has complicated relationships with Catholics. It engages in complicated ways with Catholic Protestant relationships. That's one thing I'd say. The other is in terms of intellectual genealogy. If Adrian were here, he would have talked a lot about this movement called radical orthodoxy that he is very involved with, and also John Milbank. I think that people in America read these things for sure, but it's not. I don't think it has like the kind of influence that it does in Britain. I think here, insofar as there is an intellectual genealogy, the primary character I think is Alasdair MacIntyre, who writes this book called After Virtue, which these people all love, and because he is a deep critic of liberalism, and he's also somebody who comes from the left. And I think I guess this is another point I would want to make about Catholic post-liberalism, is that it's not the same thing as like the right. These people are all would be identified with the right, but they really see that capitalism has created a lot of injustices. They want to somehow deeply reform or overthrow capitalism to create a more socially just society. So this language of the common good really does matter to them, and I think they get a lot of this from MacIntyre, who is completely impossible to place politically. So that's one thing I'd say about so that's kind of Catholic post-liberalism as an intellectual movement. And I think I've named the ones who are like the most famous. There are a handful of others, but I would just say like I think it's a growing trend. I mean, at Duke, we've had people who have come in the last 5 or 10 years who fit this mold, which is surprising. So it's on the rise in America. What do I think about it as a political movement? And so this is one of the things that I was curious to hear Adrian talk about, and I wonder what he thinks about America. My own judgment, and I'll just put it baldly, I think there's no political constituency in this country for this. I think that Catholics themselves are very politically divided, as they've always been. There are lots of Catholic Democrats, there are lots of Catholic Republicans. They often vote around the issue of abortion is a big deal here. On social justice, immigrants' rights are also very big. My own the parish in Durham where I am is a pretty progressive parish, and they care a lot about immigrant rights. Many Catholics are Hispanic. So, in terms of, I mean, and this is a little unfair, but Catholic post-liberals are essentially a bunch of university academics who write very difficult books.
Yeah.
It's really hard to see how it turns into a political strategy. It's kind of interesting though, because their strategy does not rely on kind of the masses. They have an idea of the elite. I mean, so Patrick Dedeen writes a lot about the idea of the elite. And so I think there is not a big political constituency for this, but I do think that they are in some ways not trying to conjure one. They know that. They are trying to conquer the elites. And I think here there is a more of a chance of them succeeding. I mean, people do read these people, and I would say being at a place like Duke, like a pretty secular university in the past 10 or 15 years, I would say voices like this are more common now than they were in the past. And so I mean, because these books, some people read them. I mean, they are relatively popular. They go on speaking tours. There are Catholic centers at every university, and they're trying to leverage those. So I do think there's a potential constituency amongst elite college students, but I mean, I've talked about Catholic post-liberalism as a new thing. In some ways, it's not. I mean, if you think about it, it's been around for at least 10 or 20 years. We can look at it. Some of them are now in office. I think it's exceptionally difficult to find any particular set of policies that bear the stamp of these people. Like somebody like Vance, I think is really interesting. He is well versed in this way of speaking. He speaks this language. He ran his Senate campaign as a kind of populist. These people, at least on theory, support trade union rights, to give an example, because there's a long history of Catholic defense of trade unions. It's about subsidiarity. It's about workers' cooperatives and all these things. And Vance talks about this. But now he's the vice president, and there's nothing like this. I mean, he is not pushing for these things. He is against the PRO Act, which is what, if anything, what these people should support. He is falling in lockstep with the Trump administration. And Donald Trump, I mean, it will not shock you to hear this, is not deeply influenced by Catholic post-liberalism. And so they're falling in lockstep with him. And Marco Rubio is the same way. We live right now in the Democratic Party. There's no room for these people in the Democratic Party. And the Republican Party in this country is organized right now around one person who does not care about these things. So, what does that mean for the future of this? I mean, I'm not sure. It's really interesting to think about what happens in the 2028 election. I think it's very possible that if Vance runs, we'll see something different. We'll see a kind of he might take these ideas more seriously and actually turn them into a governing platform. It's possible. I mean, in some ways, it's amazing that somebody who like could sit in this room and know everything you're talking about Thomism and MacIntyre and secularism and liberalism and all these things, is a heartbeat away from the presidency. And it's an amazing fact. I wanted to, so that's just a kind of where I see Catholic post-liberalism right now as a political force. I feel that I'd be remiss in not saying something about my, I have written about these people a fair bit, and I've read them a fair bit, and I'll just say it flat out. I think that their account of liberalism is wrong. I think they do not understand liberalism all that well, or they purposely misunderstand it. When they say they're post-liberal, the way they define liberal is they say people who care about individual expression and individual lifestyle more than anything else. And so they are very concerned about kind of like transgender people and stuff like that. And they see liberals as people who only care about the individuals, about individual rights. And I think that's simply not true. I mean, I think that it's like a kind of a crazy claim. I think that liberals as actual people care about the climate and the environment and immigrants and and the common good. And they politically, well, so I guess if you're thinking about this language and the way that it's thrived in this country in a way that as a religious person I find very disappointing, is that they have defined the common good basically as a right-wing project, because it's gonna live in the Republican Party or nowhere. And I think that they have abandoned like a very large potential constituency who really does care about the common good, because they don't take the progressive or liberal tradition very seriously from my perspective. So that's it. I mean, I think I have done as I desire to do and talked for longer than I planned to. So happy to hear any conversation amongst yourselves or any thoughts for me.
Thank you. Thanks so much, James. We do have plenty of time for comments and questions prior to lunch, so I'll throw the floor open for reactions. Yes.
Just a question.
Yep.
James, on thanks for that. That was great to hear. What you say around the harder edge post-liberals and they're focusing on elites seems to me here. I hear echoes of Christopher Dawson's work as almost an early kind of post-liberal. Is there a connection there?
Did you ask? I can't hear super well. Did you ask about Christopher Dawson?
Yes.
That's interesting. Yeah. I wonder if one could draw I mean, I will say that I've seen his name bandied about some. Christopher Dawson is an English Catholic, and I would love to hear the role that he plays in British post-liberalism, if any. But he's somebody who is really concerned about the cultivation of a new kind of elite. I do think that you could draw a kind of a genealogy that goes from something like Coleridge to Dawson and Eliot to to post-liberalism in its concern for the cultivation of this new elite. And I will say that's something that I find kind of interesting about these figures. And I imagine Australia is like this. America right now is a deeply unequal and elitist society. It is, I mean, I teach at Duke, which is an elite school. I am aware that I am training a generation of elites who are going to have a ton of power. But nobody wants to admit that exactly, because everybody still has an ideology that we are like a populist democratic society, even though we aren't. And so it's one of the things I actually appreciate about the post-liberals is their sense of like, yes, there is an elite, there should be an elite, and the way we train that elite matters enormously. And I think that's actually something that progressives or secular progressives have not really done enough of.
Auntie Joy, I think you had a question next.
Hi, Adrian. I'm a descendant of our Aboriginal people here in Victoria. This raises a lot of questions for me, continuing on to some degree around that sense of, some of the good work that's done on the ground. And this would be wider than just Catholicism, but that, what has come to this country that decimated the people in this country in the name of that particular religion, or the hybrids that came out here and the things that they've done. But around all of that is that veneer of elitism, that veneer, the princes of the church, the buildings, the amount of land that's owned, the costuming. I came out of the Anglican tradition where we had the princes and they're enthroned. And that sense of not just elitism, but that sense that we're entitled to this, that we can steal, we can murder, we can decimate, we can do whatever we like. We are immune from that because this is who we are. And of course, when I listen to that Eurocentrism and American centrism, I can understand why we have a Donald Trump, why that despotic, disassociative psychopathology of humanity that has no connection to anything except greed and entitlement. Do you see where I'm coming from? That
of course, yes.
Continually keeps leading to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Failing.
I think that one of the kind of litmus tests for any political grouping right now is about sort of immigrant rights. And if you go back to, I would say, in my view, we talked about like Dawson and Coleridge, this celebration of the local and Eliot and all this stuff that is such a big part of this. The role of the stranger or the other always plays a pretty complicated or uncertain or even hostile role in this, what seems like really nice kind of localism, right? I'm writing a book about C.S. Lewis, and so this has led me to think a lot about like Tolkien and these people. Actually, Tolkien is really popular amongst all these people. And this idea of like the nice little parish and so on, the nice little, what do they call them? The Shire and all this stuff. The role of it all sounds so nice, but like, what is the role of the outsider or the immigrant? And this actually came up in a debate. I mean, it's amazing. Vance was debating with who's now the Pope on Twitter about this, because Vance takes the view that what the faith enjoins is a love primarily for neighbor, understood as like people who are proximate to us. And Vance actually got in like a Twitter back and forth. This is before he was the Pope, where the Pope said no, and it was all around this idea of Augustines. And the Pope was like, no, that's not what he means by this. He means an actual like global universal thing. And Vance gave a speech just the other day where he was talking about how if your parents have been here since the Civil War, you have more of a right to be here than a recent immigrant or something. And and I think that the post-liberalism in general, I think, has a really hard time with immigrants outsiders with the history of expropriation and things like that. It's just not part of their intellectual architecture, in my view.
Oh, yeah, Ian, question for you.
Two Catholics that I really like, I think one is Eugene McIntyre and the Enchantment of Mammon, which I like because it identifies something about American political culture in which capitalism is so pervasive. But the other one is Brad Gregory. Do they have any kind of influence on these developments?
You're asking if Brad Gregory is like part of this world?
And also Eugene McIntyre.
Oh, in Canada.
McIntyre.
So it's not
Eugene McIntyre.
Oh, McIntyre. Yeah. Okay. So he's asking about these two people, Brad Gregory and Eugene McIntyre. Yeah, it's interesting. I actually wrote reviews of both of those books, and so it actually must be kind of a small world that people send me all these books to review. Yeah, in terms of those two in particular, I mean, I don't know them, but I would say that and I don't even know, I can't remember if Eugene is Catholic or not, but like I would say that yes, when I mentioned like I feel like this is a growing thing. I remember when Brad Gregory had this book called The Unintended Reformation that must have been like 2010 or something. And I remember seeing that book and thinking like, wow, this feels like a blast in the past. This feels like the kind of book I would have read from the 1930s. Like, the Reformation was bad. It caused liberalism. Liberalism is bad. Like this kind of apocalypse story. And I think that now that's a much more common story, at least amongst intellectuals. And Eugene McIntyre is an interesting example. I mean, he is definitely a progressive. He has this book called, I think it's called The Enchantments of Mammon. It's a beautiful book. But he shares that same basic sensibility. And so I do think like amongst, I don't know what to call them, religious writers or critics, this view is becoming more common than it was in the past, for sure. And I think Gregory and McIntyre are a part of that.
Question, extended answer.
Thank you very much for your talk. Go Blue Devils. I was a student at Duke, and I can pronounce it. This was a long time ago. And you said with the post-liberals, they saw themselves as learning from the mistakes of liberalism, but politically, taking Vance as a prime example, they've gone to the right politically, but have any of them, in terms of politics, gone in a more progressive direction, thinking of people like Bernie Sanders and Mandani in New York recently, is interesting.
Yeah. I don't want to go, I can't say the answer to that is no. I mean, surely there are some, right? And I think that Sarah's here. She might have some ideas about that. I'm struggling to think of any, I'm struggling to think of any. So it's, I mean, as someone who lives in America, I know people like around, like who go to my church or whatever, who are critics of modernity from the left. Absolutely. And McIntyre is another example of them. But I think that if you go to a conference on Catholic post-liberalism, I don't think that's who's speaking. I think that it is much more involved an effort to find connections with the right, to rebuild the virtue of nationalism. Like Yoram Hazony, I think, has been pretty influential in these circles as well. So I think that intellectually, I do think there's no reason why it could not go in a progressive direction. I don't think, but that does not seem to be where the wind is blowing right now.
Catherine, you are next.
Thank you, James. I think I'm asking this question on behalf of our colleague Stephen Duckett, who's not here, but Stephen has made the observation that in the two strands of Catholic social teaching, there's sometimes an emphasis on subsidiarity, and that it needs to be twinned with an emphasis on solidarity, which would give a different kind of feel. And I just wonder if you've got a sense of why in this post-liberal conversation, the solidarity, which in some ways is closer to a sense of common good, doesn't flourish? Because it's too much associated with the state, maybe, or?
Yeah, I wonder. I mean, in answering that question, I feel, and I guess this might get at like your bigger concerns for today about what work the idea of the common good is doing here. Because it's a curious thing, because what they'll say is liberals or even conservatives, I mean, everybody else except for us, like, doesn't believe in the common good. They only believe in individual free expression and free market capitalism and all those things. And that's not true. I mean, every political party or politician articulates some ideal of the common good. Even though it's gonna look different. And so what work are they doing by saying like this is called the common good? I think that it's interesting. I actually would read it differently, and I would think that it depends on who you're reading. I think the solidarity actually is an important part, but it's a question of solidarity for whom. I think that there is I think they have a strong sense of like the nation. Like we should have solidarity with one another against outsiders. And that this should, and but I think that what I think was behind the question, and also the earlier one about indigenous expropriation, I think a lot of people, a lot of Christians think solidarity means a kind of global solidarity, a kind of maximal accounting of love. And that kind of solidarity, I think, is one they're not that interested in. I think because maybe it's there's this separate thing about globalism, which they are opposed to. But anyway, I think Sarah has her hand up, and I know she's thinking a lot harder than me about like Catholic internationalism. So what do you got?
Oh, I was gonna build on the previous question, because I've been thinking I was gonna ask you a similar question, but it does connect to this question of solidarity too. And because I've long been wondering, why it is that post-liberalism seems to redound to the right generally, especially because when you think about the intellectual genealogy, like it is often this movement like radical orthodoxy that really refuses to, the categories of right and left. And so maybe the British context is different. It would be interesting to know how the British context might be different. But yeah, it is really striking how, I mean, I will say, I do think there are some of these people who are more on the left. And I was sort of alluding to this earlier, like people like Bill Kavanaugh, and actually Brad Gregory, I would put on this, because I think maybe the same with Bill Kavanaugh. I think certainly with Brad, that there's been an evolution in his thinking over the past like 10 years. And he's moved to the left considerably. And so some people have maybe moved in that direction, but they're definitely not the most vocal or public facing. I'd see them as kind of marginal in this movement. But then, so I listened to this really interesting interview between Ezra Klein from the New York Times and Patrick Deneen. I don't know if you've heard that one, where he really he grills Patrick Deneen, who's definitely on the right, about how to square his kind of more progressive commitments, his critique of capitalism, and his environmentalism, with the policies that these people end up supporting in the Trump administration, the Republican Party. And why is it, it's clear that Deneen is committed both to those things, but also to these culture war issues around the family and marriage and gender and sexuality. So why is it that always when push comes to shove, they're going to pick those things? Like that's kind of the nub of the discussion with Ezra Klein, is that when forced to choose, they kind of always end up siding for choosing those issues. And that you see this with Josh Hawley too, in this recent vote to cut Medicaid, where he said he would never do it, and he's really committed to a social safety net, but then when push comes to shove, he ends up voting for it. So like, what is it about this, do you think, that means that when they have to choose between these two commitments that kind of refuse the logic of the political spectrum, they usually end up going to the right? Like, is it that like they can never side with Democrats because the language of secularism is so pervasive there that they find that alienating? I'm just curious what you think.
Yeah, I mean, do you think the language of secularism is pervasive amongst Democrats?
No, yeah.
I mean, okay, so I have a couple thoughts about that. These are a great set of questions. The one thing I'll say, this goes back to my kind of more historical research looking at 100 years ago. I think it's almost a law that if someone says they're neither right nor left, they're really on the right. And because like all kinds of people, like my first book is about all these Catholics in like the 30s, and like they all wanted to say like, oh, my politics are so complicated. You know, a pox on all these parties. I reject them all. I have a, you know, a beautiful vision. And then it's like, oh, actually, also I'm a fascist if I have to choose. And like, why is it? I don't know. I mean, one answer that comes to mind is that I do think that issues of sex, gender, and the family become really important to these people. And I think it might be, I don't think it's pure cynicism or opportunism. I think that they seem like the core issues about what it is to be a virtuous person in the 21st century is like how you grapple with sex, gender, reproduction. And I think that they find a much happier home there on the right than they do on the left, because the left, even though I think there are all kinds of people on the left who are like family value supporters and so on, it's true. I mean, this is where the queer rights movement has found its home. Um, if the core issue you really care about more than climate change or labor rights is sex and children and families, I think you're probably going to end up on the right. And so that's a way of just like postponing the question of why is that the issue that's most important to them, as opposed to climate change, economic inequality, healthcare, things like that. It might just be that those that maybe like abortion and sex type things come closer to Catholic dogma. I don't know. I'm thinking out loud here.
James, you've got a question.
Thank you. A very interesting conversation. You mentioned the administrative state and then elites as two sort of straw figures that are used. And I'm wondering if there's a third power play in all of this. It's around the growing disparity, economic disparity you mentioned, in terms of concentration of wealth. I mean, it's happening very much here in Australia. Significant number of elite, wealthy, particularly just by taking things out of the ground. But I'm conscious, I think in North America, in the US, there's quite a strong growing group that is sort of on the backing from technology, billionaires, and connection around AI and all of that sort of area. We might call them an elite, but I sense they're not the ones who are being bracketed in the elite. So where do you think they're placed, those techno billionaires placed in any conversation around common good?
Yeah, I mean, there's two questions there. It's like one about what do I think, and then I mean, but what does that matter? But like, but what? I mean, it seems to me, just as like a citizen of America, that these, in any reasonable definition of the common good, I would not want these people steering the ship. And but it is also true that people like Peter Thiel seem to have a fair amount of affection for these ideas. And Peter Thiel is one of the mentors also of JD Vance, Peter Thiel, the kind of tech billionaire. I'll say that I could just ramble. I'll say I do not have smart thoughts about this. I can't quite tell. It is striking to me that if there is any industry that is dissolving the fabrics of local community, it's the tech industry. And you would think that if you are really committed to localism, if you did not want pornography, your kids have access to it, like, yeah, all these things, you would just think that technology would be posited as an enemy. But it does not seem to be empirically the case, at least for leading post-liberals. I'm sure there are post-liberals who are critical of big tech. Josh Hawley claims to be critical of big tech, but again, it's very hard to know where this is turning into actual policy. So yeah, I don't have something smart to say about this, but I think you're right to put your finger on that as like the key, or at least one of the key questions. Just like 100 years ago, it would have really mattered your stance vis-a-vis like the Rockefellers or the oil type, like just like where the actual capital is. It really matters how you engage with that. So I think in thinking about the common good politics today, how they engage or not with tech and tech billionaires is a really crucial question, which seems to me to be, I don't know what, not resolved yet.
Thank you. There's three questions. You first, and then you up the back, and then you on the side. And is it possible to have the text so we can see the room? They can see the room.
They can.
They can? Oh, good, great.
Okay, Mark Notak from the Uniting Church. Just interested, I mean, I've read authors from the US who critique the progressive liberalism. So you've got people like Frederick de Boer, How the Elites Hate the Social Justice Movement, Afemi Tewo, Elite Capture, Michael Sandel, Tyranny of Merit. Are there no Christian people who are writing that critique of progressive liberalism in the same way that those from the secular left are sort of critiquing that, which you know is largely about the contempt progressive liberals have for people on low incomes and people with formal education?
Yeah, it's a great question. There is right now such a sort of, liberals are on the defense in America right now for sure. There are, I walk into my local Barnes and Noble, and it's a bunch of conservatives attacking liberalism, and then it's a bunch of liberals attacking liberalism, and it's not clear like where the center is anymore. But yeah, there has been, and he's drawing attention to a number of books that have been critiquing the excesses of secular liberalism in the past 10 years. And this is why Harris lost and Clinton lost and all these things, because of like elitist liberals. They share that shares a lot with the post-liberal critique. Are there Christians making that case from the left? I mean, this goes back a little bit to Sarah's question before. One would think there ought to be, right? But I'm struggling to think of it. And so but I'll just say this is always, it has always felt to me like one of the great questions of American politics is like why there is not a more vibrant Christian left. And it's not a phenomenon just of like the last 10 years. I mean, I don't think there's ever been a maybe in the abolitionist period, but since then, there's not really been a vibrant Christian left. I'm not really sure why that is. But I don't think there super is right now, and I think that's why they're not writing those books are not coming from a Christian perspective.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I was wondering, in our country, the conventional religions like Catholicism, the Anglican Church, they are increasingly irrelevant in public debate. So when you talk about influence at the elections, maybe the Catholic Church could be reduced to issues of abortion that some politicians will try and pump up. But with the decline of the religious voice institutionally, and with the exception of, say, the irregular voice of some academics, what is the social infrastructure that is going to carry into public discourse what we would call issues of the common good, maybe based on Catholic social thought?
Yeah. Yeah, that was a great question. And it is sort of amazing that so much of what we've talked about in the last hour took place during the papacy of Francis, who could not be further from these kinds of views. And it raises the question of like, I'm not sure I have an answer. I will say, just like living in this country, it feels to me like I'll be very curious to see with the new Pope Leo, how this plays out. But it has really felt to me like people like bishops. Really, I mean, there are some bishops who are outspoken on political issues, but not that many. I mean, I don't think that the institutional church hierarchy, I don't know what to say, has the role that it did in the past. And it makes it really unclear where religious discourse will come from. A lot of it is now coming from social media. So I don't know. I mean, I would just say as a historian, I think you're putting your finger on something very important. The period I wrote about before, and I know a lot of people here have a historical consciousness too, but writing about the 50s or the 60s, encyclicals mattered a lot. Do they now? It's hard to say. I'm not sure. It seems like lay intellectuals are really kind of defining the meaning of the faith politically right now, which is it's a new arena. But this is true for any political ideology, right? This is true for liberals too. How are ideas being spread and circulated now? It's like a big question.
One last question, and then we will free James from this rigorous interrogation.
Thank you for the presentations. You had a beautiful phrase, James. You said they're not focused on conjuring a constituency; they're focused on capturing the elites. But somehow Trump has won 2 elections. And so I guess the question I had in that respect, notwithstanding eccentricities like the Electoral College, is do you think the way that happened was because even though they have these ideas, they don't run on them? Like, that's not what they campaign on, and so that's how they manage to win elections? Or do you think it's more covert in the sense that they capture the administrative state, they capture the courts? Like, what I'm saying is, when you say they're not trying to conjure a constituency, they clearly have a constituency. And so, yeah, interested in your reflections on that.
Yeah, and so I would say a really interesting place where these ideas, I think, have increasing purchase is in the judiciary. I think that a number of people in this world are in law schools. Robert George at Princeton is another. And the Supreme Court in America is largely Catholic, and it has a number of people who are like at least conversant with the sorts of ideas we've been talking about in the last hour. In terms of like how Trump won, I mean, that's like, I don't know, nobody knows. That's definitely like outside of my remit in this last 1 minute. I will say that, like, if we try to want to understand like what is giving some fire to Catholic post-liberal ideals, if Trump clearly represents the failure of liberalism, right? If liberal politics, which let's define it broadly to include both the Republican and Democratic parties in the post-Cold War era, if those parties had been able, and I think that it's fair to say that, like, there's a lot of bipartisan consensus around things like free trade and deregulation and things like that. I think if those parties have been able to deliver anything like social progress or whatever, like, Trump wouldn't have won. And I think what's really interesting, and a lot of things I'll say, is that on a lot of metrics, like, American life has gotten a lot better since in the last 20 years, right? We're more unequal, yeah, but we have a lot more people have healthcare, wages actually have gone up. Like, it's not obvious that we're in a complete collapse, but I think where we are in a collapse is in a sense of kind of a common purpose and a sense of the common good. And I think that this is something that Trump takes advantage of. But I think the fact that I think the post-liberals are right. There is a really fractured sense in America right now of what the American project is about, like what we're supposed to be doing, what it's for. Donald Trump like had answers to those questions. And I think that they're not the same answers as Catholic post-liberals, but they were kind of close. And one thing is that Donald Trump is willing to take any allies he can get. And so I think what we're seeing right now is Catholic post-liberals, sure, and with any human being, there's aspects of venality or whatever, like in why they take on their roles. But another way to look at it is like, yeah, this is the plan, is to get yourself in positions of authority and then to exercise power. And like, if you look at the courts and look at the federal state right now, like it might be working.
Thank you.
Okay, we should draw this session to a close so that we can adjourn for some lunch. James, thank you so much for giving your time so generously. It's been a solid hour, which is more than you anticipated. So it's been a terrific discussion. So thank you so much.
Yep. Thank you for having me. I hope you have a good conference. I look forward to reading more about it. Bye.
All right. So we have an hour. So it's a nice sunny day. Perhaps you might have a walk as well as a lunch.
Thanks.